All right. My goal in this class, and I'll probably carry over to the next one, I want to do like two different things. I want to summarize like the big three incidents that will lead up to fighting breaking out in the Civil War. But today I'm going to spend a lot more time on analyzing the underlying major cause. And my thesis is that it was slavery first and foremost. Slavery was the cause of the Civil War. Now, I think I went through this really quickly. Let me just try to summarize this a bit better than I think I did last time. We start to run out of the ability to compromise in 1854 when California enters the Union. Actually, California entered in 1850, but by the time they worked out the compromises, I think this is 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The two things that the Kansas-Nebraska Act did is it included a powerful fugitive slave law that now gave the ability of slave hunters to go deep into the North and grab any slave that they could find that had run away. Before they passed this law, even though the Constitution says that it should work that way, there was no enforcement. And so a slave that got to Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, one of these places, was pretty much free. But when they passed this new law, federal marshals had to enforce it. So if I show up in some town in Ohio and I say, this guy is a runaway slave, I'm going to seize him, the local sheriff can't say no. If he says no, the federal marshals could come in and arrest the sheriff. So now Northerners who are really against slavery are starting to realize this is terrible. And the abolitionist cause gets even more active than it was before, because now you see slaves being grabbed and hauled off back into their chains, even in the middle of a totally free state, a slave-free state. The other thing they did is that they came up with this idea of popular sovereignty. And there's a lot of opinions that I put in this slide. Congress and a series of mediocre, spineless presidents. But I stand by that. The sequence of presidents we have right up to the Civil War, they're all idiots. The worst is James Buchanan, who basically sat back and did nothing after crisis after crisis. Anyway, that's a separate story. So the idea was that we're going to let these guys in, say, Kansas territory, once they get close to wanting to be a state, they have to submit a constitution to the Senate as part of the application process. So the idea is, you guys, among yourselves, within your territorial boundaries, you decide, you vote. Okay, that's a recipe for disaster, because this is not a calm issue that people can debate and then calmly vote on. Absolutely not. You had violence, and you had people outside the Kansas territory, both pro and anti-slavery, pouring into the state to violently fight for one side or the other. So this made things worse. This is where we get the nickname Bleeding Kansas. Lots of violence, guerrilla violence, mob violence, people just being shot out in the countryside. This doesn't quite fit into the sequence of what I'm saying, but this amazing incident. Remember, I went through this last time, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. For the other class, I didn't go through it, so let me just review this, because they'll be watching this on a video. This guy, a respected Massachusetts senator, anti-slavery, made a speech on the Senate floor in which he pretty powerfully condemned some Southern politicians. This guy has relatives that he thought Sumner was insulting, and he was so angry, and he's a congressman, not a senator, but he's a congressman. He storms into the Senate and he sneaks up on Sumner, who's sitting in a chair. And before Sumner can get out of the chair, because it's attached to a desk, starts to beat him with his cane, and so severely injures him that it's going to take, I think, more than a year. I forget what I said, 2 years? Several years. Several years he was in bed, recovering from this attack. It nearly killed him. And the consequences were virtually nothing for this guy. He wasn't arrested. He didn't go to jail. He was mildly censured. And all over the country, well, mostly the South, people bought canes and sent them to him in case he needed to have another cane to beat some northern abolitionists with. On the floor of the Senate. And as I mentioned, people began to go to congressmen, senators with knives and pistols in case they had to defend themselves. All right. All right, John Brown. All right, the first major incident that really gets the war going is the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Kansas violence. John Brown, what he did is the second. In fact, there's one historian in the Civil War film by Ken Burns that says, more than any other thing, the raid that John Brown conducted on Harper's Ferry was a cause for the war. You know, even when I wrote this a few years ago, I'm still reflecting, I think, some of the modern prejudice against John Brown, that he's a fool and a fanatic. It's true that he had a really bad history of managing money. He failed time and time again. He had to move out of places because he was in debt. But part of the reason for that, let's get this picture up. You can see, look at those eyes. This guy is very intense. He becomes deeply, deeply committed to the idea that slavery is this huge moral evil, and it has to be stopped. And he believes that violence is an okay thing to be using to stop slavery. And in that sense, that did put him out in kind of a distant mindset compared to other abolitionists in the North, who didn't necessarily advocate violence, but advocated that we pass laws against it to stop it. He got involved in the fighting in Kansas. And even though this sounds like it's really cruel and terrible, the reason that he did kill some pro-slavery activists in this little town in Kansas was because they had attacked his sons, who were living nearby in another village. I'm not defending the idea that these people were killed with swords. They were executed, but it's not just that he's attacking anybody in this bizarre, arbitrary manner because he's so into stopping slavery. So when this happened, he kind of disappeared for a while. He went into Canada, but then he began to solicit support from prominent northern abolitionists that had money. And there's a bunch of people in Massachusetts, respectable people in Massachusetts, that actually began to pony up some funds for him to buy weapons and recruit followers. Now, if this guy was a crazy fanatic fool, it's unlikely he would have had solid citizens in upper reaches of society support him. So again, the picture that this guy is nuts, the facts don't bear it out. Nevertheless, this is mostly the way he's portrayed. In U.S. textbooks for generations, John Brown is portrayed as nuts. And this, more than anything else, this famous mural in the Kansas Capitol building sort of captures that, especially, look at those eyes. So, it's true that this raid on Harper's Ferry had zero chance of succeeding. He's got too few people. The idea that slaves will somehow hear about this and be able to run away from their plantations and find their way to him so he can give them weapons to start this massive slave rebellion, that's just not likely. And he's got so few people that even if there was no military presence to stop what he was doing, just local citizens, just local white guys in the neighboring area, and everybody in America has guns at this time. Maybe not so different than now. And actually that's what happened. Mostly it was local citizens that stopped him. They barricaded him in the armory where he was taking the weapons from, and they held him there until a force of U.S. Army soldiers led by, remember who it was?
Lee.
Robert E. Lee, who's only a captain at this time. Robert E. Lee comes and breaks into the armory, kills most of them, kills John Brown's son, severely wounds John Brown, and he's captured. But again, a book that I read several years ago analyzed a lot of his letters, things he wrote, things he said to people. Just the way he acted on the day of this raid. As soon as they did seize the armory early in the morning, he basically just kind of sat back and didn't do much. The indication is that he knew that this plan was never going to go anywhere. He didn't care. What he did care about is carrying out this massive act of provocation. Now, that's still a thesis. You could argue it. I tend to lean towards that interpretation. I think this guy totally knew what he was doing. And he was offering himself up as a martyr. He knew he would be killed or captured, and this plan would never succeed. But he knew that it would be like throwing a match into a barrel of gasoline. He knew it. And that's exactly what happened. Do you remember what I said about why Southerners would freak out so much about some white abolitionists coming into the South offering slaves a chance to rebel? Why is that such an inflammatory thing for a Southern slave owner? Liz?
Because there's more slave population than there is just
In
slave
many parts of the
population.
South, slaves outnumber whites. And there had been violent revolutions or rebellions. The Nat Turner Revolt is the most infamous. Southerners literally had a constant fear that slaves would rise up, and what's the phrase I said is often repeated in literature against abolitionists?
In our sleep.
Murder us in our sleep, which is what Nat Turner did until he was cornered and captured by Southern militia. So Southerners looked upon this guy as the real version of what abolitionists really wanted, which is to provoke African slaves into violent rebellion. So even a peaceful abolitionist, basically the South put them all in the same basket. He said, even if you are peaceful and you're sending literature into the South to try and advocate for abolition, all you're doing is stirring up the slaves. You're giving them a sense that they can somehow eventually gain their freedom. So an abolitionist who dared to go into the South, which actually nobody did from maybe the 1850s on, would probably be murdered. And Southern Post Office, the postal system, never would deliver anti-slavery tracts or books or articles. Abolitionists were seen as basically inciting murder, the possibility of murder. So this is a huge deal. As soon as this happens, Southern militias, citizen organized military groups, begin to recruit and they start to drill, which means that the South is starting to get ready for some big conflict. All right. And again, I'm repeating this also, but I have to do it for the other class because I didn't get as far with them as I did with you folks. This is maybe, oh wait, did I say there was 3? Okay, now I come up with 4. Kansas, Nebraska Act, John Brown, Dred Scott, and the last one's going to be the election of Abraham Lincoln. I'll get to that a little bit. So this guy, Dred Scott, he ran away, lived in a northern place, northern town, for years and years and years. Finally, a slave catcher catches up with him, tries to arrest him. He goes to court with the support of sympathetic whites who gave him money for legal fees, and tried to argue that he'd been free so long, come on, give me a break, don't make me go back. When it got to the Supreme Court not only ruled against him, but they made the ruling so broad as it destroyed the entire basis for compromise, because it said, if a white man owns slaves and he wants to move into a free state, he can do it. It's his property. That destroys the whole concept of a free state. Now, any state is a slave state. I mean, the only stipulation is maybe you'd have to buy your slaves in a southern state before you take them north or west. But now there's no boundaries on slavery. Abolitionists now are getting to the point where, oh God, there's no legal means that we're going to be able to stop this. So there really is starting to be a militant anti-slavery movement arising in the North. The Southerners are not entirely mistaken about that. I'm not going to go, well, let's see. If I have time, I'll come back to this. Abraham Lincoln's election basically sends a signal to the South that, okay, we're screwed in terms of keeping slavery. Abraham Lincoln was a bit of a moderate. There were some other guys in his party, the brand new Republican Party. Today's Republican Party, the party of Donald Trump, was created essentially with the candidacy of Abraham Lincoln. They've evolved quite a bit in a different way. Lincoln was openly against slavery. But what he was trying to say time and time again, we have to work this out peacefully, gradually. By no means was he saying, as soon as I'm elected president, we're going to send armies into the South to end. Not at all. After he was elected, he bent over backwards to